Hello and welcome. My name is Anders Morley, and I am here today to talk to you about my book, This Land of Snow, A Journey Across the North in Winter, which was released at the end of 2020. But before I begin, I would like to say thank you, first of all, to the Greater Victoria Public Library for the invitation to speak to you and to record this little book talk for anyone who's interested in seeing it. I'm going to talk for somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 minutes, and then wrap things up, and you can watch it at your leisure. So the book, This Land of Snow, to be brief, is an attempt to tell three stories, and those are the story of a journey across a space, and that space is, roughly speaking, northwestern Canada, the boreal forest belt of northwestern Canada. And then the second story is a journey across a season, and that season is winter. And then the third story is a journey through a tricky part of my life, which was kind of an existential crisis, a crisis in my marriage that coincided with my departure on the physical journey that I describe in the book. So that more or less is a summary of the book. Now, of course, it's on one level an adventure story, but I wanted to write a story that was something more than just, an adrenaline-driven adventure story. I wanted to put the events in context of my life, and then use the experience as an opportunity to think about a few themes that interested me, like winter ecology, and the relationship of us as a species to the landscapes that we live in and that we move across. And so hopefully I've managed to weave all of this into a cohesive whole that makes sense, and that is also, a source of pleasure for anyone who wants to read it. So what I would like to do now in these few minutes is talk a little bit about, first, the background of the journey, how and why I decided to go on this journey. And then I want to just take you along the way for a little bit, kind of a few highlights, show some pictures, and read some passages from that describe my experiences along the way. So the background. When I decided to embark on this journey, I was living in Italy. I was living in a city. I should say that I grew up in New Hampshire, in northern New England, which is kind of a rural place of mountains and woods and lakes. And so I lived in Italy because I had married an Italian woman, and I lived there for close to a decade. And after about a decade there, I started to feel this intense sense of anxiety. And it was partly homesickness, partly just kind of an unhappiness with the shape that my life had taken. And one day I happened to see this picture of a man in a National Geographic magazine, of a man crossing a river in some northern mountainous place, carrying a pair of cross-country skis. And something about the picture just kind of cried out to me and said that this was what I needed to be doing. And so that sort of triggered this kind of meltdown, to be honest. And I decided that was what I was going to do. But the problem was I didn't really talk very much to my wife, but I just kind of dropped it on her one day, and she completely rejected the idea that I was, that I might abandon her for 4 or 5 months and go off and, do what she thought was just sort of this, a fun vacation for me. But I saw it as something that was kind of existentially necessary. And so this led to a clash. And this clash becomes, as I mentioned in my intro, central to the story. And so it's a story that parallels the story of my departure on the journey, and then finally the journey itself, and then it goes on beyond that. And I'd like to read a little passage now first, actually, just to kind of set this scene, and also writing about this was an opportunity to articulate, why the idea of going on this journey appealed to me. In the fall of 2011, I told Elena, my wife, that I wanted to spend the winter of 2012 and 2013 traveling across northern Canada on skis. The words Northern Canada were enough to make most Italians I knew shiver, but I didn't think the plan should come as any surprise to my wife. She knew how I'd grown up, and I still spent much of my free time hiking, camping, and backcountry skiing. Before we got married, I had even asked her for a promise that once we were married, she would not stand in the way of my lifelong dream of someday making a months-long self-propelled journey on my home continent. Since such rustic ambitions were far from her civilized experience, at the time I'd given her the Appalachian Trail as an example of what I meant. She consented to as much, doubtless imagining me sauntering under the summer sun from village to village through a friendly eastern Arcadia. She was a reasonable person, and there was nothing offensive in such a plan. I lived in her country after all, and although I didn't dislike it, she knew I had a powerful connection to the woods and lakes and hills at home and was often sick for them. It was only fair. But what I proposed now was a different beast. Why does your trip have to be you alone in northern Canada in the winter, she asked. She worried that the cold and the sparse population made death or disappearance so much more likely. It didn't have to be Canada, I had reasoned to myself before unveiling my plan. I could ski across the continent, dropping down out of Canada every so often to touch on snowy American places like Minnesota or northern New England. But when I looked more closely at long-term snow cover trends, Canada was obviously the safest bet. And I had a special fondness for Canada. My father was Canadian, and I took pride in telling kids at school that I was only half American, that I was equally a Canadian. Canada stood in my mind for an earthier kind of freedom than the abstract liberty of the Pledge of Allegiance we recited every morning. Since I'd spent my childhood bouncing back and forth across the invisible border, I considered the whole continent an extension of the woods that stretched away from our house to north and west. It was all, in some way, home. A few months in Canada struck me as the perfect medicine for my diffuse sense of nostalgia and civilizational glut. That it would be winter was part of the point. What better way to skim off the dross of soft urban living than to remove all possibility of comfort? Winter added an element of the remoteness I sought as well, since snow and cold make wild places harder to encroach upon, although I was equally interested in the settled places I would come to. I wanted to learn something about how people lived at the edge of the wilderness and in places where winters were long and hard. I had grown up in the southern part of the snow belt and had always felt something pulling me north. My upbringing, as well as my education in an alternative public school system where Thoreau, Aldo Leopold, Wendell Berry, and Annie Dillard were the canonical writers, had instilled in me the idea that the unbuilt world had lessons to teach us that were transferable to our lives in built society. So Canada, it had to be, and it had to be winter. As to the matter of my going alone, a casual survey will reveal how few of anyone's circle of acquaintances would happily join in spending the 4 coldest months of the year living outside, traveling on foot all day and making a new camp every night in places where North Dakota is considered southern. My wife was convinced that the reasons I gave were not the real reasons. Excuse me for a minute, there's a dog that needs to be let out. My wife was convinced that the reasons I was giving were not the real reasons. She thought there was something deeper that I wasn't being honest with myself about. This and the fact that she seemed to doubt my ability to stay alive in the cold made me feel like she didn't trust me. I resented it. What hurt her most of all, she said, was that I had made the decision without first discussing it with her. I had made it by fiat. When I hatched the idea of traveling across a season and a continent, one of the things I was genuinely interested in was how people made lives in places where winters were long. I'd settled on the boreal forest of subarctic Canada as the perfect laboratory for my curiosity. The boreal forest, alternatively called the taiga or the snow forest, is the evergreen ecosystem, sometimes sprinkled with birch or aspen, that girdles the northern hemisphere between roughly 50 and 70 degrees of latitude. In my mind, it represented the space where wilderness and civilization met to negotiate their differences. To the north were the barrens and the tundra. To the south were the prairies of northern hardwood forests. It was a place where you could travel for weeks without seeing another person, but also a place where there were modest-sized communities linked together by single-lane roads, which sometimes saw no traffic for days. It was home to a spread-out population of Canada's First Nations and home as well to bears, moose, caribou, wolves, and millions of smaller fur-bearing creatures that historically made it the heart muscle of the Canadian fur trade. The rivers of the Precambrian Canadian Shield, the exposed geologic backbone of the North American continent, once pulsed with the canoes of voyageurs, the rugged French-Canadian couriers of the Hudson's Bay Northwest companies, which were the key players of the trade. Small farms poked the southern edges, hemming off tiny fragments of the endless forest with fences, but mostly the land was too cold and nutrient poor for agriculture. Had I been seeking only solitude, I would have set my sights in the beginning, not on this peopled wilderness of the near north, but on the far north, where population is so sparse that for a traveler on foot, the land is effectively empty. Nevertheless, by late summer 2012, a colleague could suggest that my reductive thinking habit was making me into a misanthrope, and perhaps not be far off the mark. And so that is how things stood when I set off. That's kind of the why and the consequences of my decision to go. At this point, I want to jump over for a moment to screen share to share some pictures with you. And the first picture will be a map of my route, just to give us a sense of orientation. Now, when I first hatched the idea in the comfort of my living room in Italy, I thought that I would be able to ski all the way across Canada in a single winter. But it became apparent after just a few weeks on the trail that there was no way, at the rate I was going, that was going to happen. And so what you're looking at here is the route that I actually traveled over the course of that winter. And when I realized that I wasn't going to be able to make it all the way across Canada on skis in a single winter, the focus kind of shifted a little bit. I said the balance, I guess you might say, shifted, and it became more important to experience the whole winter outside. The journey across a season became more important than the journey across this vast space. And so, I wasn't as much of a purist as I had been at the outset about skiing every inch of the way. So there are places where I would accept lifts from other people. At a couple of points, I jumped a short way ahead by bus, and I kind of did some zigzagging around because I was less interested on just moving east as I had been originally. And so you see my route here. Started in Prince Rupert on the northwestern coast of British Columbia, and basically skied due east, with some zigzagging across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So what I'm going to do in these next few minutes is focus on just a couple of places. First, I'm going to talk about crossing the Kitimat Range in the Coast Mountains between Terrace and Telkwa, which is near Smithers in northern British Columbia. And then I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about skiing on lakes on the Canadian Shield. And to do this, I think the best way, since you're here for the book, presumably, is to read a few passages, which I think are probably far more eloquent than my off-the-cuff speaking about them. And so here we are climbing up this river valley, the valley of the Copper River, up to a pass called Telkwa Pass, and then down another valley to the little village called Telkwa. And the distance over the mountains is something like 150 kilometers. So I'm just going to give you sort of a few snapshots from along the way. Striking camp is the bane of winter travel. You want nothing more than to move because it's the coldest time of day, but you can't yet. I often whiled away the sheer boredom of the task by speculating that it was the hassle of breaking camp that ultimately made our hunter-gatherer ancestors abandon the wandering life, plant seeds, and trade tents for houses. The worst part of breaking camp for a wintered wanderer is every day seeing more and more condensation getting folded into the tent that you've worked so hard to keep dry. Once I was back on the trail, the climbing started immediately. This meant whole miles of sapping herringbone steps. Climbing in herringbone steps is usually a last resort for skiers, a tired and awkward technique for going over short stretches of terrain that are too steep to skin up. But with a heavy sled at my back, I sometimes had to advance this way for an hour at a time. This time, it was early in the day, so I relished the effort. The landscapes were stunning. I knew I was the only human on all the land I could see. The mountains were beginning to look like real peaks, masses of rock and ice that soared above tree line. Unimaginably tall yellow cedars, Nootka cedars, towered around me, their lime green sprays of needles glowing as brightly as the snow. The trees were laden with snow, but seemed calm and at rest. The sun striking them made a kaleidoscope of glinting colors. During a cruising descent after a 3-mile climb, my mind eclipsed itself so that it was nowhere else. The uphill struggle had so absorbed my mental energy, drawn me so deeply into the weave of the winter world, that I was in a state of pure perception. The intensity had begun as pain, but without lessening, had morphed into pleasure. A flock of pine grosbeaks came in over my left shoulder and started making noise. I kept an eye on them as I slid effortlessly downhill, and in a minute it occurred to me that they were dressed the same as I was. Red heads and breasts, black beaks, black and white wings, and spindly black legs. They flitted from tree to tree beside me as if stepping down the hillside to keep me company. It would have been no great leap to believe I was picking up odd words among their piping, the way one does in a language one has studied only a little. Once I entered Telqua Pass, which is laced across with a chain of small lakes, I had to traverse a row of talus slopes that angled like buttresses where the mountains met the narrow valley floor. I had to cross one slope up high because alders had smothered the trail below. I proceeded nervously across what I knew might be a twitchy snowfield. Alone and with an anchor tied to my waist, my chances against an avalanche were hopeless. Suddenly, the white side of Redemption Peak peeled away in front of me, and a boom hit my ears. Powder billowed out from the steep slope of the 8,500-foot mountain. It exploded hundreds of feet into the sky as if a buried charge had been set off. I stopped in my tracks, knowing I would have to cross the path of the avalanche in minutes. So fortunately I survived, but this was kind of the first big scare of the winter, and the first time that I seriously asked myself, what the heck I was doing out there. So I made it over the pass down to Telqua and continued skiing on into British Columbia. And all along the way, I was surprisingly, it seemed like almost every time I came into a place that had any people anywhere, which happened, sometimes not for a week, but sometimes every few days, I was always greeted with this incredible warmth and generosity, and often invited into people's homes for a meal or to spend a night under a warm roof. And as I mentioned in that first reading, that I had become kind of a misanthrope by the time I'd set off on this journey, just because of the way things had gone. But there was this very real sense in which all of these people that I was meeting along the way, these warm and generous people, were kind of trying to pull me back into the human community. So I made it across British Columbia and then Alberta, where I occasionally had to ski out on the open prairie. It was January at that point and very windy. And so some of the coldest parts of the winter were spent there. And then finally I came into Saskatchewan. It was February. It was still cold, but very sunny, and the days were longer. And it was just kind of, I was often found myself in this sort of ecstatic state, just sliding along through the season. But there were moments of hardship too, physical hardship and psychological hardship. But I don't want to dwell too much on those. But I would like to talk a little bit about the experience of skiing on lakes. Excuse me for just another split second. There's another dog issue. Sorry about that. My dog is in a very whimpering mood today. He's incidentally, his name is Beowulf, and he is a character in the book, for those of you who are dog lovers. But as I was saying, I want to read a little bit about skiing on lakes mostly in Saskatchewan, but much of this goes for Manitoba as well. So this is kind of a medley of passages. I'm gonna start by talking about leaving the town of Pinehouse in northern Saskatchewan. Pinehouse is a little community on a Cree and Métis reserve in northern Saskatchewan, and it's on the shores of a lake called Pinehouse Lake, and it's probably the friendliest place I've ever been. Kind of, there's this almost otherworldly sense of harmony seemed to be at play there. Something about the place is just almost magical in my memory. But this is about leaving. I skied southeast across Pinehouse Lake, rounded a point, slid past an island over a small pressure ridge, and kept my eyes peeled for a large angled boulder and a buried pickup truck that I was told marked the entrance to the first portage trail. Pinehouse Lake, Bar Lake, Johnson Lake, Neil Lake, Besnard Lake. The lakes of northern Saskatchewan are strung together by well-trod trails the width of a canoe. They are low, cozy tunnels through dense bush or sunken traces across windblown tracts of muskeg. To travel by them requires a leap of faith, for there's no way besides hearsay to verify their existence from afar. Yet miles and miles of travel are staked on their presence. Along the most frequented historical routes, they are marked with dashed lines on topographical maps, but there's often no way of knowing when they were last used, and trails, when disused, disappear. But if you give your trust to the lakes of the north and the hidden trails that connect them, you will find a network as seamless as any modern highway system. To travel this region is a lesson in the power of trust and cooperation. And now this next section, I have just come through a whiteout storm that descended rather suddenly while I was out in the middle of a large lake. And then I got across the lake and I'm about to go on to the next lake, and the storm appears to be clearing. The north wind blew so hard that it pushed the last of the clouds out of the way by the time I hit my stride. It was as if a curtain had been whisked open by the sharp tug of a hidden stagehand. Now the late afternoon sunlight saturated the atmosphere. The sky was a vibrant, even blue, and the view to the far side of the lake was so clear it looked like I could touch it. If I kept a fast pace and didn't wander off course, I could put the 5 miles behind me before dark. Then I wasn't sure how far I would have to go to La Ronge, but I decided I would call my contacts from the other side to let them know I was all right. The wind hit me and I leaned forward into space. There were moments when it felt like I, the only thing different on this vast expanse of sameness, could be lifted off the planet and sent unremembered into orbit. I skied as fast as I could. The sunlight on the snow was blinding and I was glad I had my glacier glasses. Long streaming drifts spread out for miles on all sides. The wind kept up so forcefully out of the north along the 5-mile expanse of lake in that direction that I imagined Boreas somewhere up there with his cheeks inflated, like you see him on old maps, blowing his lungs out. There's an unmooring from time and space that comes with traveling over wide, monotonous expanses. I spent 2 nights and parts of 3 days on Lac La Ronge, and I have few localizable memories of it. I only know the numbers because I wrote them in my diary. A thin black thread of land on the southern horizon and the sun rolling overhead kept me generally oriented without demanding that I think about it. And for the rest, I just leaned into the direction of dawn for 10 uninterrupted hours at a time. The world I could see consisted of exactly 2 elements that kissed each other in a perfect seam along a horizontal line: blue sky and white snow. There were 2 tent sites, but in memory they've merged into one, the terminus of a straight line from the west I'd left behind me. Looking back, I could see the line retreat towards a golden horizon, but vanish into the flatness long before it got there. Near the end of the second day, not far from the southern end of Long Lake, I bent away from my eastward line to head south through loose snow towards Nipikimu Bay. The diary reports that progress slowed in the absence of a hard snowpack. I made camp earlier than I had the night before to avoid the bite of the twilight wind. And so in the book, there's lots of physical descriptions of travel like that, and there's lots of reflection as well, as I said, on winter, what winter means to us as a species, and on how we move across the landscape. And then lots of this kind of becomes fodder for metaphor for me that helps me to come to terms with the fact of my apparently disintegrating marriage. So the journey had a disastrous effect on my marriage, as was predictable. And afterwards, I didn't end up going back to Italy, and things only got worse and worse. But almost, well, I don't want to say miraculously, but pretty unbelievably, after 5 years of separation, my wife and I managed to work through our differences, and for several years now, 4 years now, we've been back, more than 4 years now, we've been back together. And I think I can say that our marriage is better than ever. And so it was it was after this separation had ended that I really found the focus for the book, and understood that winter itself was kind of a metaphor for this life crisis, and that sometimes, you know, to get to spring, you have to go through some kind of a winter. So what I'd like to do to close is just read the last couple of paragraphs of the last chapter, in which I kind of tie up some loose ends. No matter how any of us chooses to live with those we love, still, it's good to be alone sometimes. All my life, people have been telling me you should never travel alone, said wilderness canoeist Bill Mason. But it's interesting. I've never been told that by anybody who's ever done it. When you go into nature spaces by yourself, and it doesn't have to be a great wilderness, your ego can melt away as you become absorbed in minuscule facets of the world that in company you might never have noticed. A minute ago, I looked up from my paper and pencil to watch an ant scramble under the left front foot of a bright green lizard and then zigzag up the lizard's shoulder. The lizard stood perfectly still, with wide eyes unflinching, except that its torso abruptly expanded and contracted every few seconds, as if it were a granite statue breathing. The air vibrated with the cicada chorus, and I felt a bead of sweat bulge on the nape of my neck until the surface tension broke and it raced down the valley of my bare back. The thick lap of super saline Mediterranean wavelets nearby beckoned me to plunge into the sea. When we go to the wilderness alone, we're reminded that our human life is itself just a minuscule facet of the world. We're also reminded, especially if we go in winter, that at some point each of us is going to die. Just as the sense of our own smallness next to the totality of nature can give us an ecstatic sense of participation in the greatness of the whole, the reminder of death built into the cycle of the seasons can sharpen our awareness of being alive. An intimacy with winter makes it sometimes unsettlingly apparent that nature is not some volitional force that cares whether we live or die. Caring is what humans do. It's why we make homes, our little refuges in the wilderness, and trails that lead us back to those homes, where we find other people who care for us and need our caring in return. It is this that holds the human center and gives life that wonderful oxygenating of the coursing blood, the soft, warm glow we call meaning. And I think I will end on that note. So again, the book is This Land of Snow, Mountaineers Books 2020. Thanks for listening to my little talk. The book is in the Greater Victoria Public Library System, I believe. It's also available for purchase at any bookseller. There's an audio version. So if it sounds interesting to you, check it out. And thank you again. Thanks to the library for the invitation to be here. And thanks to those of you out there in the ether who have listened. Thanks for giving me a few minutes of your time. And so long.